Gradual Awakening is, of course, about enlightenment, which I know nothing about. So it's already an interesting dilemma to start to write a book about enlightening when you're not enlightened. But I've had many great teachers who definitely show me that there's another way of life and another way of being, another way to be on the planet. And I can definitely, my family members can attest to how much anxiety and depression I've had in my life. But being around great masters in the Tibetan tradition for the last 20 years, I have been so inspired and encouraged that as human beings we have incredible capacities for development. And even if I could just have a small fraction, if I could just have a small modicum of the kind of insight, attitude, awareness, and presence that they have, then I would probably spend my life well, it would be a life well spent. So I guess the first place to start is our predicament that we share together. And I don't know how many of you have children. Raise your hands. And if you don't have children, how many of you are concerned about the predicament of the planet right now? Okay, and that should be all of us. The planet is in an awful state, in an awful condition. And with 2 young kids, I've had to really think about constructing a narrative to make sense of how did we get here? And when I say here, I mean with the fact that the ice caps are melting and the sea rise level is increasing, and the fact that there is a unbelievable unjust distribution of wealth on this planet, and that et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that there's definitely enough food to feed the entire planet over tenfold, and yet we, at least in the United States, waste somewhere on order of 30 to 40% of all our food. Symptoms like this, for me, beckoned a kind of intellectual answer. How did we get so far gone, if you will? So far gone that we would be on the verge of mass extinction, not only of the biosphere and of all the species, but also the human species is in danger. We are endangering ourselves. If I could use an analogy, it would be similar to being in a life raft in space and puncturing it. And that's what we're doing. And so I had to come up with some kind of way to explain our situation. And the way that I've done that is just to look in history, and I've found at least a couple places in human history where there's a kind of pivot or pendulum swing. One of them occurs, as you all know, 300 or 400 years ago in Western Europe, when we were under the mandate of an intense religious, authoritarian nature. The kind of political authority of religion had stifled the liberty of the human being. And with the corruption and the pedophilia and whatever else came with it, the crusade and whatever else came with it, you can see that the human spirit needed a shift, on a large scale shift, human consciousness. That freed human consciousness from the dictate of political authoritarian religiosity that's grounded in dogma, in faith, in blind faith, right? And so I think what happens at that pivot point that we're calling in history called the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment is that we swing a pendulum away from blind faith towards science. And as that pendulum swings, we release the individual for creative outpouring, and with it comes medicine and technology and the World Wide Web, and we send a human being to the moon, and we find ourselves now the benefactors of a legacy of science. But we also find ourselves so far to the right of science now that we have lost spirit. And that's why, in my estimation, we find ourselves at least in our Western ethos, very consumeristic, very capitalistic, very materialistic, very reductionistic in our thinking. And with that, we have kind of marshaled our human creativity towards mastering only the material world. But we have, in a way, thrown out the baby with the bathwater 300 years ago because we needed to get rid of religion, but we forgot about spirituality. And spirituality to me is just the breath of life. It is the intangible essence of what makes us human. Things like love, compassion, interconnectivity, altruism, these have all been part of the auspice of religion and values. And when you throw out religion and you throw out spirit with it, what you get is a society that is increasingly powerful and capable in its manipulation of matter, but yet in a way atrophied in its ability to share human experience and to have empathy and to recognize principles like interdependence and causality. And so that's how we can destroy, in our wars and in our fear-mongering, we can destroy parts of the planet and be so short-sighted about its interconnected repercussions on us. And so with that as a kind of framework, I have been very fortunate for the last 25 years of my life to be connected to the Tibetan tradition. And in the Tibetan tradition, one of the unique features of the Tibetan tradition is that in its history, it maintained a core science, a deep philosophy, an ontology, an epistemology, a study of the nature of reality, but it never jettisoned and it never sacrificed a kind of essential knowing of the human quality of the mind. And so it's a very interesting study, Tibet, because it is one example on the verge of extinction of a society that both prizes science along with spirit. And for example, the Dalai Lama, people like the Dalai Lama, they think he's cute, and he's giggly, and he's cuddly, and he's kind, and he has a very simple secular message. But the Dalai Lama also has a number of different faces and hats that he wears, and he's an incredibly coherent scholar and a yogic meditator. But he also, in his political cabinet, for example, people don't know this, but sitting on the political cabinet of the Tibetan government in exile is an oracle. And it is actually this oracle that the Dalai Lama consulted in '59 that enabled him to find the opportune time to flee Tibet. So the very fact that the Dalai Lama is alive is because on his political cabinet was an oracle. So here you have someone who is steeped in being in the world and yet has no fear or compulsion about acknowledging spirit, the unseen world of spirit. And so there is in the Tibetan community what I have come to know and come to really love is this beautiful teaching called the Lam Rim, which simply means a gradual approach. And the Lam Rim in Tibetan history is distinct from what is called spontaneous enlightenment. So you guys are from London, and you must have by now, especially the spiritual community here, must have heard of Eckhart Tolle. So Eckhart Tolle represents a kind of someone in our contemporary society who's had a spontaneous enlightenment. I think his story is something like he was sitting on a park bench in London, very, very depressed, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, and instantaneously he had a kind of breakthrough, a sudden breakthrough where he shattered his inaccurate beliefs about himself and the world and gained some kind of transcendent knowledge. And in the Tibetan tradition, this has always been a truism. It's been, it's not that it's not possible, but from the Tibetan point of view, it's considered very rare. So if you had a spiritual inclination, and Eckhart Tolle resonated with you, and you went about trying to replicate his experience, in my limited knowledge, I'd be fearful that you'd be sort of hanging around waiting for lightning to strike, or like waiting for the spiritual lottery to happen. What happened in Tibet in its early years in its dissemination of receiving Buddhism from India is that the kings of Tibet, the patrons that were paying for the pundits to come and disseminate knowledge from India, is that they elected to really patronize the alternative to spontaneous enlightenment, which is called the gradual path, Lam Rim. It is like like when we went to university, for example, we studied classes at the 100 level, and they served as a foundation for us to proceed with a deeper kind of knowledge until we reached perhaps a master's thesis. And so there's this kind of incremental progression of knowledge. And the Lam Rim is that, but it is about spiritual knowledge. It is about it is a methodology or a genre of teaching that allows a human being to assess and study and reflect on the nature of their own mind and the nature of reality in a spiritual way, but to do it in an incremental, kind of no pressure, lifelong commitment. And for me, that's much more exciting. Maybe it's because of my own limitations. Maybe it's because of my own disbelief that something miraculous might happen to me. But I think I would much prefer spending my whole life in a structured, committed process. And along the way, it's no longer about, yes, it's going to happen, no, it's going to happen, all or nothing. I'm going to have a spiritual experience or I'm not. It's more like 5 years in, you can look back and you can say to yourself without any question that you have matured. You have learned something. So it brings you out of the camp of being all or nothing, all in or nothing, which I think for me is probably much more useful for the masses. It's not to say that it's the rare one that has an amazing breakthrough doesn't happen. It certainly does. I mean, Krishnamurti, it happens to Amma, it happened to a lot of people, relatively few though, considering the masses. So the book is a practical guide based on this curriculum that has served in the Tibetan plateaus for thousands of years. But rather than presenting it in a very traditional way, because there are many books that present it in a traditional way, I tried to use science as a land bridge to help people who have a Western mindset appreciate the language, the terminology, the rituals, without a kind of suspicion that we have about religion. Isn't it true that even after 300 years, we're kind of so tired of religion that even well, maybe not this crowd, because you're sitting in a place where there's books surrounded by yoga and occult, but maybe your neighbors or your colleagues, even the mention of meditation or yoga brings a kind of shrivel, at the very least, and maybe some repulsion and disgust, and maybe a bit more. But if you wanted to try to massage someone into understanding and appreciating the nuances of a spiritual practice that has been around for thousands of years, maybe contemporary terminologies from Western psychology and neuroscience would be really appropriate. So that's a little bit about how I shape the book. Is I take this ancient methodology, and I use this methodology because I see us in a particularly challenging time in human history, where if we don't do anything, if we get paralyzed by the forces and the conditions and the circumstances, then we can definitely all agree that our political leaders are not going to do a bloody thing for us. And then who is it up to? It's if not for us to each take a small step and a small sense of responsibility for altering the zeitgeist of consciousness on this planet. And so if you are one of these people that feel, I'd like to make some small contribution, I'm kind of tired sitting in a concrete block on the treadmill trying to earn a living. I mean, the rents in London are unbelievable. I mean, I can't believe what it costs to get a taxi over here. You know, never mind plan a holiday. You know, and then you sit on your beach in Greece on your holiday, and it lasts 2 weeks, and then you're right back into the game. And as a therapist in Manhattan, I have the same thing, a trail of people that come in to see me who are existentially unsatisfied and dissatisfied with modern urban living, and especially the youth. People that are under 30 in Portugal right now know there is no future for them. And it is incredibly disenfranchising and alienating for people in Athens, and even people in New York City, where the rent and the loans and the student debt are mounting, and yet there is no call and no opportunity for them in a material world. And yet, because they have a mind and they have a heart, it is so possible for each of us to do something worthwhile with our lives, to not invest so much in the material world, but to reclaim a portion of our life energy for some kind of inner experience, which is, you could say, God-given or innate. Nobody can give you pride, and nobody can take you away. Your self-esteem is not bought or sold. Your consciousness is God-given, or is part of your birthright. And we have, in a way, been shortchanged by our culture. that has deprived us of the methodologies and of the sentiment or purpose or mission to reclaim our humanity and our spiritual sensibility and give us opportunities to really flex our spiritual muscles again as human beings. And if enough people invested as much time as they do in their bodies, for example, I don't know about you, but the fitness craze, for example, with people's disposable income and with people's limited time, they will at least spend an hour on the treadmill or in a class trying to get some beautiful abs or, you know, like a nice butt. But if we were able to just portion off a little bit of that time and appreciated that mind, a human mind, is the most powerful determining factor in our happiness or our unhappiness, not the external circumstance. And when I say this to you, it's not like I'm preaching to you. It's something I firmly believe, and it's something I have failed again and again to really master. Okay? And every time I get an opportunity to talk about it, the main purpose and the main person that I'm really speaking to is myself. Rife with anxiety and rife with confusion, I still have devotion enough to know that my mind is extremely powerful and underdeveloped as a result of my cultural context. And so the book is for it's not a moneymaker, believe me. And it's not going to be a New York Times bestseller, believe me. It's for a very, very narrow band of people. Not even the people that are interested in mindfulness. I don't know about you here in London, but in New York City, there's a lot of interest in mindfulness. Is that true here? Yeah. Okay, interest in mindfulness is a good start. Okay, but it's not enough because really the interest is really from a self-centered point of view, right? It's really about, well, I'll bring it to Google, and we'll train the executives of Google in mindfulness so that they can be even greater profit mongers, do you see? Or we'll bring mindfulness into the United States military so that we can create even better sharpshooters, do you see? So there's some essential ingredients from mindfulness when it was extracted like a mineral from Tibet and India that they excluded. And one of those things is called wisdom, and the other thing is called virtue. And when you have all three, like a stool with three legs, you have a much more coherent program for spiritual growth. Wisdom has to do with understanding that we are all connected on this planet. If we continue to live as isolated, if we continue to live like the rise of nationalism, okay, is a distortion, a complete distortion that can lead to chaos, right? We have to start embracing the fact that the markets are interconnected, the oceans are interconnected. What happens in Quebec or what happens in Uzbekistan affects the rest of the planet. What happens on the other side of the tracks, where we used to be able to say, oh, well, it's over there, it doesn't affect me. Now we know it definitely affects us, right? So once you have this worldview that is congruent with the interconnectivity, then you have to have a decent heart. I mean, I'm not sure about you, but I actually had a wonderful 3 cab drivers. My first 3 cab drivers in London were all lovely people. I mean, they were jolly people. We had nice conversations. It's not that way in New York City. What happened to decency? What happened to humanity? What happened to compassion? What happened to loving kindness? What happened to honor and integrity in our business interactions, in our school systems, in the way that we hold the fringes of society, our elderly people, our homeless people? These things are lost. And mindfulness isn't going to be enough. People at the mid-range of society or the cream of the crop socioeconomic who are embracing mindfulness, if they don't bring the sense of interconnectivity, the spirit of universal responsibility with it, then it may just be a narcissistic reinforcement. So what I try to do in the book is really set out the full stool upon which you could really spend the rest of your life cultivating deeper humanity, appreciation for interconnectivity, stabilization of mind in order to access profound mental qualities that are innate. They're not given by your social class or race. They're not given by societies or up on high. They are part and parcel of who you are. And that's an incredible that provides an incredible sense of dignity. And as I look at the youth, people that are 30 and younger, I feel that they have lost their dignity because they have been priced out of the market situation. And yet they are, as the Tibetans say, their mind is like a precious jewel that has been covered. And that's how I like to see myself and all of you, is that we each have a precious jewel that no one can take away and no one can give. But it's up to each of us to uncover it and to make it shine, to polish it, polish the mind that is capable of discerning reality in a way that makes us more altruistic, more responsible, greater agents of change for the planet at a time of great peril. So that's the book. Any questions? Yes?
You mentioned mind a lot of times, and also heart. How do they define mind? Because the heart's obviously very important in this day and age as well. You know.
It's interesting. So the question is how are the mind and heart differentiated or defined? And in the Tibetan tradition,
Yeah.
mind and heart are actually the same thing. And actually, if you ask a Tibetan Lama to point to their mind, where do you think they point? I'll ask you, where's your mind? Point to it. Right? In Western culture, we do this. Do you know where the Tibetans point? They do this. Right here. And actually, there's good neuroscience to show with the vagus nerve system that actually our body and our nervous system are capable of vast amount of data filtering and processing. Like, have you ever walked into the room and you had a funny feeling in your gut? Or you just knew it in your heart? The body is a sensitive machine and it's full of wisdom. But as a result of our left brain, intelligent focus, neck up, reductionistic paradigm, we have kind of cut ourselves off from all the other juicy bits of our psyche that are available, but they've been kind of atrophied. And of course, the Tibetans define mind as something that is clear and knowing. And what that means is that it's just like a mirror. The mind is capable of reflecting reality like a mirror. But for most of us, that mirror has been either distorted like a funhouse mirror at a circus. Does everybody know the Funhouse Mirror? Like, so when you go into the Funhouse Mirror, I look even larger than I actually am. Or I look really skinny in certain areas. Right? And so the mind that is apprehending reality from a place of distortion but doesn't know it's a distortion, then reacts to that distortion as if it's real. You follow? And that's what the Tibetans and the Buddhists in general are claiming is our existential predicament. We are all looking into a distorted mirror about ourselves and reality and confused thinking that that's the reality. Whereas the Tibetans help you understand that you are actually seeing reality through a filter. And if you could clear your filter, you'd be able to see reality more clearly. If you could see reality more clearly, you could respond to reality more clearly. For example, we don't live in a world where we appreciate consequences. And every ancient culture, every spiritual culture on the planet before Western modern industrialized culture appreciated cause and effect. Whether they called it karma or not, they understood what you say and what you think and what you do does matter. Okay, when you throw out religion and you throw out with it virtue, then you, 300 years later, you are part of a legacy of people that don't think anything matters. You don't even matter. One of the things I had in the conversation with the cab drivers was that they all said, funnily enough, they all said, well, there's just one life to live. So live it up. Go have a few pints. Or book that vacation. You see, and that is a modern phenomenon. And I'm not here to preach and I'm not here to impose, but just for your consideration, what if there was more than one life? What if consciousness, just like energy, was indestructible? And how would we be living if we knew that there was consequences to our actions, not just for ourselves now, but ourselves tomorrow? Well, some of us do appreciate that. That's why we have insurance policies, right? Because we don't know what might happen to us tomorrow. So we invest in something now to protect us for tomorrow. But then when death happens, we think that's it, and we drop off into the abyss, the nihilistic abyss. Consciousness just fades. But every spiritual culture on the planet for millennia has appreciated that there is no just black hole there. There's a continuity. And so what we do now matters in the future. And so better to be more virtuous and kind and sensitive and generous, because there is consequentiality. So that's just one of the answers to what is the mind. Are there other questions? Comments?
What advice would you give somebody like Donald Trump at a time in... It doesn't even matter about the country, I would say. If you look at that as a personality and the divisiveness that you could say is potentially correct, what advice would you give him?
Yeah, so the advice I give to Donald Trump is, in a way, it's, I'd stay away from being singular in my focus, because Donald Trump is a symptom of a larger cultural problem. And actually, if we're really honest, there's a little Donald Trump in all of us. Okay? And if you're not willing to go there, then I'd question your sanity. Because we all have some, maybe not an extreme version of self-absorption. And we all have some, maybe not an extreme version of prejudice. And we all have some, but maybe not extreme version of fear-based grasping. Right? And from a Buddhist perspective, Donald Trump is a kind of exaggerated superhuman. The qualities of prejudice, greed, and aggression have been cultivated over time, like Arnold Schwarzenegger's body in the 1980s. Okay? But, given a different circumstance, given enough education, given enough cultural conditioning in a spiritual milieu, it'd be better for us to include Donald in a cultural reprogramming than to target him as the adversary and pigeonhole him. And we'd be much better off if we include ourselves in that and say, well, we're all kind of sick. We all have this kind of sickness, which is what the Buddhist perspective is that we're all living with a kind of distortion to some degree or another. It can get full blown in its full expression, like the Donald Trumps or the Erdogans of the planet that are crippled with greed and self-absorption. But we could also, this is the beautiful thing, we could also be like Dalai Lamas. The wonderful thing about the Dalai Lama that I've come to appreciate is that there's nothing special about the Dalai Lama that separates him from us. There's nothing special about him. If we start to make the Dalai Lama a special case, then we remain here in this basement thinking we're incapable, and there's special people out there, and we kind of co-sign an excuse for ourselves. And if we do the same in the opposite direction, well, Donald Trump's a special case, then we kind of excuse ourselves from taking responsibility that in each and every one of us are these imprints from history and from genetics and from evolution that are causing us angst and causing us and blinding us. So that's a better, it doesn't answer your question, but that's how I would answer it.
I don't think there is an actual answer to the question.
Well, I was sneakily trying
That's
to avoid
all
it. Yeah.
Have you got any opinions on world government? So you said where we're all going is wrong.
Yeah.
We need to to all work together. Have you got any opinions on using the United Nations or some body as the total power in the world?
I mean, I preface all this, but this is not my area of expertise, politics. And what I did in the book was I really, I tried to really collaborate and listen and learn from experts who I've spent 20 years in Tibetan Buddhism. And in a way, to be honest, I found a ceiling with Tibetan Buddhism. Like, it's a wonderful thing to embrace a spiritual paradigm, but it has its limitations because we do have to create new agricultural systems, new government, new economic systems, and I don't think the Buddhists have the answers when it comes to those things. So one of my lessons in writing the book was this is now a period of collaboration, where people from various disciplines, cross disciplines and cross cultures, can collaborate. For example, the Dalai Lama for the last 20 years has had a series of dialogues with Western scientists. He's doing that because he recognizes the limitations of his own tradition and values enough the input from people who have a different perspective. And there's this beautiful metaphor in the ancient texts of 4 people holding one part of an elephant. They're all blind, or they have blindfolds on. One person has the tusk, one person has the feet, one person has the tail, and one person has the ears. And they all think they have their bit of reality. And it's not until they reveal that they've just got one piece of it, and that actually you need to know what your neighbor's got in order to get the fuller picture. And I think that's one of the fortunes that we find ourselves in the modern era, is that we can still have dialogue now with people, and we can make a more robust picture, a more complete map, if you will, about the inner world, about the mind. We could have scientists and psychologists and meditators at one table sharing their notes about what is the nature of mind. But we could also sit with people who have smaller egalitarian societies that function on a grassroots level. We could have tribal or indigenous cultures that have learned something for thousands of years. Like one of my friends is doing a documentary film at Standing Rock in the United States, where there's this great crisis happening, where the iconic picture is the National Guard versus the indigenous culture. And what you see there is this iconic picture of spiritual people who are weaponless and powerless against the larger militaristic kind of elite, if you will, the Western Guard. Okay, and my friend is doing a documentary. He was able to get hold of a spiritual elder, and it's very potent. This image. He looks at the camera, at my friend who's from New York City. He's about a 30-year-old, and he looks at him and he says, "Your way of life lasts about 200 or 300 years. In other words, your way of life is sunsetting right now. This is the tail end of your civilization. My way of life," what he's talking about, the indigenous way of life, we could live on this planet indefinitely. And so one of the things is we need to be able to sit with and appreciate, and rather than have a kind of hubris that we're like, Western civilization is so great. It has an amazing repertoire, no doubt. Its contributions to science and medicine are superior. But maybe we're lacking something, and with enough humility we could sit at the table with some of the tribal elders of the Hopi and of the Tibetans and of the ancient Indian science of India. Maybe we could together create a larger map. And by the way, I would recommend very strongly a book by Daniel Pinchbeck. Daniel Pinchbeck spent 10 years researching alternatives to politics, alternatives to agricultural resources, alternatives to technological resources, and alternatives to economic policies after a full survey of the world culture. And he found very practical examples that actually, instead of feeling so disempowered, right, because I can definitely feel disheartened when you turn on the news, it feels so big and vast, the problem. But actually smaller groups of people have figured wonderful things out. Like, for example, Bitcoin can completely do an end run over central banking cartels and their ability to price out and manipulate vast amounts of money. So there are wonderful technologies and wonderful ingenuity happening. There are solutions is a wonderful thing that's captured in Dan Pinchbeck's book. But one of the other things that he suggests also is that we are having a kind of naivete, childlike naivete, where we look at Theresa May or Donald Trump or Obama or the Clintons and go, well, are you going to solve it? And he says that paradigm is over. And what you see now in the Arab Spring, and what you see now in Wall Street with the 1% movement, what was it called? Occupy. You see grassroots movements are happening across the planet where it's people, ordinary people like you and I, getting together instead of being bombarded by the marketing propaganda that disempowers us. We turn off the television or chuck the fucking things and start talking to each other. And there's a tremendous power in the populace. If we stop going to Walmart, what happens to their stocks and what happens to their ability to return to their investors? who has the power really? The only problem with the Occupy movement is that it was short-lived. But the spark, the impetus of a grassroots movement of people coming together and feeling like together in solidarity we could do something, I think is hopeful and optimistic. I think that we should learn our lessons from history, like the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring. If we can get clarity about using that movement to establish a new kind of paradigm or establish a new system, then we could bring it to its full fruition. So that's why it's important, I think, to speak and collaborate with people who are on the cutting edge of identifying new agricultural systems. Like, I don't know about you, but the planet's topsoil, for example, is completely, at least in the United States, is completely worthless, rendered worthless because of our big pharma or big agro way of producing food. But a few really smart people know exactly how to replenish it and regenerate it. So then it becomes a matter of taking on the big corporations. Well, their bottom line is all about money. So if we divest, if we use a collective grassroots movement to divest, and then are clear about what the solution is, maybe it's possible. I mean, this sounds a little naive. Probably some of you feel it's really naive. But I don't have a choice with two children to become hopeless. I have to try my best to remain optimistic and to at least try. I'd rather die trying than to fail by being complicit. Well, I love pilgrimage. And I just came back from a pilgrimage in Nepal. And 2 years before that, I did a pilgrimage in India. And I brought 30 of my students, my closest students, with me. And I got to say, in 17 days, I saw more transformation in them than working with them for years and years and years and years. Okay, and I'm not saying that was because of me, because I brought them to see some of the great masters who are actually actualized. And I brought them to places that are imbued with power over centuries and have a kind of imbued significance. And these are people like maybe you and me who have been raised in a Western society or culture that are starving for something very potent. And bringing them to be in touch with the Tibetan culture, or it could be the Indian culture, it could be the Native American culture, it could be a pilgrimage to the Amazon, it could be, there's a big influx of interest in plant medicines such as ayahuasca, where people are meeting the shamans of Peru, for example. So venturing outside of our societies gives us information about what we're missing. But then having a place that's imbued with power and meeting great masters is incredibly enriching for the mind. It is incredibly potent in helping us conceive that it is possible to live in a different way. Because I think underneath it all, we don't really believe that much. We don't have any mystery or magic anymore. It's a little like God is dead. You know? So pilgrimage is a meditation in motion, but it's more than just going to your center and doing mindfulness. There is something significant about the people that you meet on pilgrimage. There is something about 20 or 30 people dropping their persona as being, I work in finance, or I'm a cab driver. Everybody drops it and gets one purpose together. They're united by one purpose. And they visit a powerful place and are influenced by powerful teachings, and they have been exposed to people that have transformed some element of their being. And in 15 days or 17 days, something really radical can happen.